My name is Billy McDonald. I am the third. My father was junior, and in 2010, I had a heart attack and open heart surgery, and my wife sent me a picture of my father in a P12. And I kept looking at this picture of this P12, and I said, there's something wrong with this picture. And finally, I realized what was wrong with this picture. This P12 was absolutely brand new, just rolled out of the factory. And it was shining, just like a new Cadillac that had come off the lot. So I said, well, I got to find the rest of these pictures that go with this P12. And I went into my sister's basement, and I found 17 boxes of documents, 30,000 pages of documents, which we donated this morning to the Smithsonian. And when I reached under the first box, all the documents were wet underneath. And when I reached under the 17th box, they were wet too. So I had to pull out each letter one at a time, peel it off the top, get a hairdryer out and start drying it. And then I would start putting them in categories. This is the men on the flying trapeze. This is the Chinese Air Force. This is China National Airways Corporation. This is Pan American. And then I got a map out, and I started pinning it, and all the way across China, then all the way around the world. And it took about 6 years to dry all these papers and start tracking down who these people in these pictures were. I mean, I knew who my father was, but I didn't know these other three guys in the picture, who they were, and did I have permission to use their pictures in a book. And so then the idea came about writing a book about my father, because I found that in 1977 he had started his book, and shortly after starting his book he had a stroke and lost the ability to speak in the use of his right hand, and it looked like his book wasn't going to get written. And so when I found the papers, I said, well, by God, that's a regret I can remove from my father. So I don't care if we make a dime on this damn book, we're going to write this book. And I am severely ADD and severely dyslexic. And I did make a C in freshman English my senior year at Auburn with the football team. So I had some minor handicaps to kind of overcome. So I wrote out the first manuscript, and my wife, who's here, where's Nancy? Nancy's been the star of this project from the beginning, and my wife read it and she said, you really need an editor. So I called Peggy Maher up, and Peggy Maher is the president of CNAC Association, and she said, oh, that's no problem, I've got just the girl for you. So Barbara Evenson, Barbara, raise your hand. This is my editor and my publisher and my co-writer. And Barbara called me up and she says, I don't know who the hell you are, but Peggy called up and said, whatever it is you need, I'm to see to it that you get it. So she came down to our house from South Dakota, and she was there for 1 year working on this book, 1 whole year. And she was an absolute delight, and she lost about 30 pounds, and I said, well, if you lost 30 pounds, do I get a discount? And she said, no. And so then, along with Peggy, we got her a husband, Chris. And I said, all right, well, and there's Chris. And Chris's father was a CNAC pilot with my father, and died when actually they were working on the book. And I said, well, we got you a husband out of this deal. Do I get a discount? And she said, well, we'll see. Barbara, as the guy who was writing the checks for the book, I said, do you want a percentage of the book or do you want to get a check? She said, oh, check will be fine. I got more than my money's worth. When you look at the book and the way the book is laid out, I think Barbara just absolutely did a fabulous job, and for what I was hoping the book would be, it turned out to be much more than I ever expected it to be. So I'm very, very, very proud of the book. We were invited to China by the Chinese government and by 8 Chinese museums. We went in 2016. I presented the book and a copy of my father's Chinese wings to these 8 museums, and were royally treated by the Communist Chinese when I was there, and I was a little nervous about going to Communist China. But every time you walk into a museum, and there's a big, tall picture of Chenault and a not quite as tall picture of my father, and down at the bottom it says, "These are the Americans who came and bailed us out in World War II and saved our bacon." And they are very much beloved in Communist China. I've been to Formosa before, but it was my first tenure in Communist China, and all I can say is they got one hell of a lot of people over there. So I do want to thank Barbara and Chris helped me with the maps, and her son Adam also helped on the book, and the reviews we have gotten have been really rather remarkable. It's been out about a year, and we've sold just over 1,400 copies, which I'm told is pretty good. We were about to conclude a deal with the Victory Museum in Nanking on giving them the papers when Barbara called up and said, "Oh, stop, hold your horses, I've got a better place." And she mentioned the Smithsonian, and fortunately the Chinese were dragging their feet. So the Smithsonian won. There was another museum that was ahead on the list, and that's the Heritage Research Enlisted Man's Museum at Maxwell Air Force Base, Gunner Annex. And the curator said, "Well, we would really like to have the papers, but the best thing for your father is for them to come here." So I thought that was pretty neat of this guy who wrote the foreword in the book to say they need to be in the Smithsonian. So that's why we're here. What I'd like to do is just go ahead and start on this presentation. It's not terribly long, but the name of the book is, and also my children are here. Will, Maggie, and Lucy are here, and I very much appreciate them being here. Didn't want to leave my children out. And half of a grandson who'll be here in October is here. More than half. So the book is, and since this is a pretty informal group, I gather, I will mention that the original name of the book was The Ghost Tiger, because there was an article written by a writer about Daddy that I really liked called The Ghost Tiger. And I was in China, and I had a university professor came up to me and says, "Well, if you're going to translate this book into Chinese," which we were talking about, "you can't call it The Ghost Tiger, because the Chinese character of ghost has an evil connotation to it. So, son, I don't care what you name it, but you got to change the damn name of the book." And I said, "Okay." So I called Barbara up, and we changed the name to The Shadow Tiger. So it was originally The Ghost Tiger. And I'll go ahead and throw in one last story here. There is an airfield in Kunming where CNAC used to land that is now a military airfield. And they don't even let Chinese on this airfield unless you're a big-time Chinese, much less let an American on the field. So I'm talking to the Kunming Aviation Association, and there are 3 generals. There's a retired 5-star general, a retired 3-star general, a retired 2-star general. And the 2-star general calls up, and they said, "Hell no, you can't bring an American on this base." And the 3-star generals called up, and they said, "Absolutely not. You can't bring a 3-star general on this base." And the 3-star general punched the 2-star general in the ribs and said, "Let's call our big, fat 5-star commie red friend over here and let him call him." So he called up and started screaming over the phone, and the translator's explaining to me that he said, "Well, I've got my car is going to show up at the gate in 15 minutes, going to have an American in the back seat, and I want you to let him on the base so he can see the terminal where CNAC landed. And if anybody's got a problem with it, you tell them to come see me." So in I go into his car, and we pull up to the gate, and they got 2 of the biggest Chinese you ever saw in your life. These guys are like at least 6 feet. And I came in the base, and they told me, "You can't take any pictures. We can take pictures for you." But I went into the building that my father had walked up the steps when he was a captain with CNAC, which was very exciting. And I was coming down the steps, and I'm not into spooks and ghosts and all those sorts of things, but at one point I felt a shadow over my shoulder. And honest to God, I really did. And sure enough, I turned around and there was nobody there. But I called Barbara up that night and I said, well, I got a new name for the book. It's now The Shadow Tiger. So that's how the book became The Shadow Tiger. So now we'll start on The Shadow Tiger and see if we can get through this reasonably quickly. The name of the book is The Shadow Tiger. Barbara, it took me 10 months to talk Barbara to be the co-writer. And finally she said, well, why do you want me to be the co-writer? And I said, you will not put your name on something that is not excellent. And so finally, after 10 months, she gave in and she agreed to be a co-writer. So I'm very proud to have her on the book, and it is her genius in the way she laid this book out that I think has really exceeded my own expectations. Mac learned from his next-door neighbor, who was World War I ace Jimmy Meisner, and he created a desire to fly in Mac and took Mac on his first plane ride when he was 14 years old. And Mac was hooked at that point on flying. In 1930, he was appointed to flight school at Brooksville in Texas by Senator H.L. Black, junior senator from Alabama, future Supreme Court judge. And his last check ride in flight school is with a First Lieutenant Claire Lee Chenault. And it was the beginning of a friendship that would literally last a lifetime. He went from there to Selfridge Field in Michigan and studied high-altitude flying, navigation, and how to fly a tri-motor Ford. In the middle of the year, his enlistment was up, and he was released into the reserves as a second lieutenant. He spent 4 months looking for a job in the civilian aviation industry. Of course, there were no jobs in the civilian aviation industry. So in December, he went by Maxwell Field in Montgomery and looked up in the bottom picture on the right-hand side. The big fella is Luke Williamson. And Luke was an old friend from Brooks Field, and he promptly reintroduced him to now Captain Chenault, who is in the middle. And Captain Chenault had just been named the head of the 3 men on the Flying Trapeze, which was the 1st Army Air Corps acrobatic team, predecessor to the Thunderbirds, I like to think. And Chenault said to McDonald that Lieutenant Hansel is leaving the team to go into the bomber wing. The way you became an officer back then is you certainly didn't follow pursuit planes. You went into the bomber wing if you wanted to become a general. And Hansel did. And he offered the job to Daddy. And Daddy said, I'll take it. And he enlisted as a buck private, making $17 a month with a bunk under the headquarters building. So he had about 4 months of training to make the team, and in the next 3 years the team performed 50 shows across the United States and were seen by approximately 1 million people. This is a 38-second strip of film that shows you what the team looked like, and it is off of a disc. This is so she won't sue me. This is off of a disc called Feihu, F-E-I-H-U, which you can find on the AVG website. And it's one of the best AVG films that I have seen. And Lydia Rossi is who you can contact. I'll get to if you want to get a copy of this. But I found this on the beginning of the history of the AVG.
It's a throwback to the dashing pilots of the First World War. During the 1930s, he had been the leader of a popular flying team in the United States Army Air Corps, who called themselves the 3 men on the Flying Trapeze. The daredevil stunts of the Flying Trapeze were proof to Chenault that fighter planes could engage in combat in close formation through the most violent of maneuvers. But the high command of the Army Air Corps believed that a new generation of bombers had made fighter planes obsolete, a novelty to amuse the public, but useless in modern warfare. After years of ridicule at the hands of his superiors,
Chenault would continue to fight for pursuit planes through 1936. In 1935, this is the team as winners of the Miami air races. McDonald's on the left, Chenault is in the middle, and Williamson is on the right. They were seen by a Chinese delegation of officers who offered them lucrative contracts to go to China and train Chinese fighter pilots. And Chenault declined the offer for all 3 pilots, but asked them if they would keep it open until he got the test results back for second lieutenant. And now Sergeant McDonald and Sergeant Williamson had taken the test along with about 80 other sergeants in the Army Air Corps. And you guessed it, of the 80 people that took the test, there were only 2 people that failed, and that was McDonald and Williamson. And Chenault took it as a personal insult and wrote a rather scathing op-ed in the Montgomery Advertiser, sort of blasting the high command, which was probably not the most tactful thing to do. And he came back and told McDonald and Williamson that you guys need to go to China. And if things don't go well for me, and I don't expect them to, I will probably be a year behind you. So McDonald and Williamson bought out their enlistments for $89.60 apiece. They went to the Chinese embassy in Washington and they picked up $500 in traveling expense money, which was the most money my father had ever seen in his life. And they made it across country to Vancouver, Canada, and they got on a Canadian ship. It couldn't be a U.S. ship due to the Neutrality Act. And on that ship also were the other people Chenault was sending to China, the 2 most important being C.B. Smith, his mechanical expert, and Ralph Watson, his armament specialist. So off they went to China. And when they got to China, they went to Hangzhou and they went to the Central Aviation School and they met with Madame Chiang Kai-shek, who was the head of the Aeronautical Commission. And her comment was that you have 1 year to work with these men and a great deal is expected of your work. And this is a picture of the 1936 Hankow Advanced Training Class. Most of these pilots would die within the first year of the war, and the reason being there were 91 combat-ready Chinese planes, and there were between 500 and 700 combat-ready Japanese planes. So it was a mismatch from the word go. And this was released in 2010 by the CIA, and it covers Madame Chiang Kai-shek sending McDonald into Japan to pick up Chenault and do a little spying while he was there. They gave him a new passport, they gave him a new name, and his cover story was he was manager of an entertainment group of 42 entertainers. When he got past the Japanese immigration officials, he jumped on a train and went to Yokohama. He climbed on board the USS Garfield and found Chenault. They slipped off and got a rental car, a convertible of course, and McDonald took pictures and Chenault took notes. And the article goes on to say, like 2 young operatives, they had an unhealthy appetite for getting too close to airfields and harbor installations. And it took them 3 days to drive back to Kobe, where McDonald had entered the country. They got back on the Garfield and going up the Japanese coast, they took more pictures of large industrial complexes that were being built right on the coastline as though it were a country getting ready to go to war, which of course it was. Let me get to the next page here. Yeah, this is a good story. In 1937, on July the 7th, the Japanese attacked the Chinese at the Marco Polo Bridge near Peking. And that is the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War. Many consider it to actually be the start of World War II. This ship is the Izumo. It is an old, light Japanese cruiser. It is moored in front of the Japanese embassy in Shanghai Harbor. And it's actually quite a really pretty picture of Shanghai Harbor in the background. And on the 13th of August, it began shelling the Shanghai Civic Center. And on the 14th of August, an American pilot, chief pilot of China National Airways Corporation, Captain Chuck Sharp, climbed up on top of a bank building that housed the RAF Flying Club. And he was there to observe the action. And he looked down the Yangtze River, and there were 3 Chinese fighter planes coming down the river. And they were Hawk 3s, they were biplanes, but they were the best the Chinese had to offer. And he thought to himself, you know, those planes are in suspiciously tight formation. And I would bet you that those are not Chinese pilots. And the 3 planes came in and made dive bombing runs on the Izumo. And according to the notes which I found in these papers, a letter from Sharp, that all 3 bombs just barely missed hitting the ship, which was kind of astonishing to Sharp. But they did come back, and each of them strafed the ship twice. And Sharp climbed down from the bank building and later confronted Chenault and McDonald and Williamson and asked, was a rumor true that you were paid $1,000 apiece to attack the Azuma? And they would neither deny or confirm the rumor. Well, when I spoke to the Kunming Aviation Association, I had one of the 2-star general that I mentioned before came up and said that story is absolutely true and is rather widely known in China. So it was a nice verification of the story. Now, this is an important airplane. This is a P-36 prototype. It does not have retractable landing gear. It has no military markings, and it has no guns. And Chenault could require the Chinese to buy him the airplane of his choice while he was in China, and this was it. It was delivered to the aerodrome at Purple Mountain in Nanking as they were trying to lead the defense as the Japanese moved from Shanghai toward Nanking, moving to the west. And Chenault couldn't hear anything. People don't really appreciate the fact that Chenault had been in this open cockpit plane all of his life and was practically completely deaf. A lot of people don't realize that. So the first thing he took out of the plane was radio. He said, hell, I don't need a radio because I can't hear anybody on the radio anyway. So what he would do is he would take and when he took the radio out, this plane became the fastest plane in China, faster than any Japanese plane. And it became the highest flying plane in China. And Chenault would fly it up and fly around McDonald Squadron, because if you were a single American advisor, you were given the option of becoming a squadron commander in the Chinese Air Force, which my father accepted. And he would fly around my father's squadron as they fought the Japanese and made notes in his notebook. And in the notes, he said, this is how the Japanese pilots are trained. These are the strengths and weaknesses of the Japanese airplanes. And during one of those missions, some Japanese pilot had the temerity to take a shot at Chenault. And Chenault took great exception to that event. And he landed and told the mechanics, he said, I want guns put on this plane as fast as you can get them put on this plane, and the next SOB that shoots at me, I'm going to shoot back. So they proceeded to take 3 or 4 days to put guns on the plane. And the first person to take the plane up after it was armed was Billy McDonald. And he landed a short time later with bullet holes in the tail of the plane and reported to the mechanics that 3 of the guns didn't fire at all and 1 of the guns only fired half a load. And if I were y'all, I would get all the guns on this plane working before I sent the colonel back up in the Hawk 75, which they did. And this is kind of one of my favorite pictures. This is Chenault giving my father instructions on a mission, and this is the Hawk 75 in the background being refueled and rearmed. And my father had a number of duties at the aerodrome, and one of which was called Mac Off. And C.B. Smith, who was the mechanic, whenever there was an air raid alarm, they would run down from Nanking Clubhouse, and he would take the Hawk out of danger. And for some reason, he seemed to always come back with bullet holes in the plane, and most of the time he had empty guns. And we calculated, and it is a calculation, I have no firm number on it, that he had at least 112 encounters with armed Japanese planes over Nanking. He found the carrier Rougeau. They attacked the Rougeau, and his pilots that he trained dropped 1 500-pound bomb just short and 1 500-pound just long, and they didn't sink it. But they did make it move. They caught it the attention anyway. He also found the Kaga, which was sunk at Midway. They were told by the American ambassador, the Japanese ambassador had informed the American ambassador to inform McDonald and Chenault that they both had bounties on their heads from the Japanese. And there were 2 squadrons of Japanese fighter planes in Shanghai that were specifically assigned with one task. Your job is to shoot down the Hawk 75. There were 4 other pilots that also shared time on the Hawk 75. General Mao was one of those, not the General Mao, but a General Mao. Now, the other thing that was interesting at this air base, it was right next to Nanking Country Club. And Chennault and McDonald would send off their squadrons and occasionally walk across Nanking Country Club and play a couple of holes of golf, waiting for their guys to come back. And late in the day, they would walk across the golf course and walk up the hill to Nanking Clubhouse. And to relax at night, they had rather vigorous ping pong games, and McDonald and Chennault were always a team, and they played C.B. Smith and Harry Sutter, the Swiss radio specialist, who at the end of the war was tried for espionage and found not guilty. And after one of those vigorous ping pong games, Chennault came down and said, I got a hell of an idea. Let's recruit 100 American pilots and get 100 American planes and give them the proper tactics, and we can kick the stuffings out of the Japanese. That was in December of 1937. I have the letter. It's in your files that you have now in the museum. And that was the first mention of the AVG. William Pauly did not invent the AVG. Claire Chennault came up with the AVG long before Pauly ever thought of it. And this is from the British Archives, British Naval Attaché Robert Aiken's intelligence report dated March 7th, 1939. That night I had dinner with Colonel Chennault and an American instructor named McDonald. The latter is credited with having brought down a large number of Japanese, but he was reluctant to talk about his combat activities. The story, for what it's worth, is that he was paid so much per hostile aircraft crashed. He was making so much that the Chinese reduced the payment to $1,000 in gold per plane when McDonald said that on those terms they could go and shoot the blankety things down themselves. It does make you wonder, if they cut him to $1,000, what in the world were they paying him before? So I thought that was a relatively good source. And of course, my entire life, my father never mentioned that he had ever been in a fighter plane, ever, because they were sworn to secrecy. He and Chennault and Madame Chang had a deal that they would never discuss their combat activities because they were guilty of a felony. They were in violation of the United States Neutrality Act, and they didn't want anybody to know. And my father never commented on whether Chennault ever shot down a plane. And he got in a pretty good tiff with Captain Williams, who was an AVG historian, about that. And he said, well, as far as I know, he never shot down a single plane, and I wasn't in the plane, so how the hell would I know? So he took some real exception to that. Well, McDonald and Chennault, and there were about 12 Americans that were there, and the Chinese government were run out of Nanking by the Japanese in December of 1937. And Chennault and McDonald were, a couple of months later, ended up in Kunming, about 1,000 miles to the west, and the government ended up in Chongqing. And the reason they went that far west is to get out of the range of Japanese carrier aircraft. And they started up the school in Kunming, and McDonald estimated that it would take 2 years to train a Chinese fighter pilot from scratch. Now think about it. You and I, everybody in this room has shot a shotgun at a bird before, and you don't shoot at the bird, you shoot where the bird's going to be. And you're trying to train a bunch of Chinese who've never shot at a bird before, and it was a pretty big task to convince these Chinese that you don't shoot at the plane, you shoot where the plane's going to be. But over Chongqing, they were holding their own against the Japanese when all of a sudden the Zero was introduced. And the Zero shot down 27 Chinese planes in one battle. And the Chinese Air Force was effectively done. They had some planes left, but as a fighting force, they were effectively done. Chennault made plans to go back to the United States to see if he could build a fire under the people who were working on the AVG, to see if he could get planes and pilots headed toward China as soon as possible. Now, he realized that if he did come back with 3 squadrons or 100 men and 100 planes, that he would need ground transportation to move these ground crews from base to base, because if he had them just at one base, the Japanese would just overpower them with bombs and airplanes, and they would be destroyed on the ground. So for that, he picked China National Aviation Corporation, which was 55% owned by the Chinese government and 45% owned by Pan American. It was based in Hong Kong, which was a Chinese colony surrounded by the Japanese. It had 9 planes, had 9 pilots, And it is the only airline in history to only take off at night. It is the only airline in history to ever prefer to fly in bad weather, the worse the better. And because the Japanese did not have night fighter capability. And it is the only airline to have a published schedule in a war zone ever in history. McDonnell negotiated his own contract with CNAC, which resulted in a tripling of his pay over 2 years. And he negotiated a contract with Pan American, which made him a captain with Pan American. At the time of his choosing, he could return to the United States and forego the 5 years of seniority that was required and be made an immediate captain with Pan American Airlines. And that, he referred to, was a job with a future, and he wasn't going to let go of that option very easily. Higgs and Engel negotiated their own contracts, and I was unable to locate those contracts with CNAC. So there were 3 extra pilots with CNAC, and frankly, CNAC needed the pilots. But flying into Chongqing was really quite an ordeal. You had to fly over a 3,000-foot group of wires that came across the mountain over the Yangtze River, and then you had to make a dive for the runway. The runway was 2,100 feet and was on a sandbar in the middle of the Yangtze River. And this is McDonnell's first flight, and as you can see, he's overrun the runway, and his rear wheel is stuck. And they're trying to get his plane out of the mud so he can take off before the firebombing in Chongqing starts that day. And here is a picture of the runway in the middle of a sandbar, in the middle of the Yangtze River. And you can see, I think you can see on that picture, the wires that you had to fly over and then make a dive to try to get to that runway. The man in the picture is Ned Jones from Birmingham, who was a friend of my parents, who introduced them to each other in Calcutta. And when Chenault gets back from the United States, he's got the planes coming. Camco's deal has been cut. They finally got Polly on board. He's got the pilots coming by ship. And he goes, first person he goes to see is McDonnell. He says, I'm naming you Chief of Staff of the ABG, the first Chief of Staff of the ABG. And McDonnell said, all right, I'll take the job if I can get a leave of absence from CNAC and a leave of absence from Pan American, because I'm not giving up that option with Pan American. And within 2 weeks, he knew that the answer from both entities was no, you cannot have a leave of absence. So Chenault said, well, that's fine, but you've got to come up with a replacement. And so he called his good friend Harvey Greenlaw from Hanoi. And Harvey was an airplane salesman who sold planes to the Chinese just like everybody else did. And the story of the phone call to Greenlaw is in the first book called The Lady and the Tiger, written by his wife, Olga Corbett. Dan Ford wrote a book, but he left that section out of the book. So as much as I like Dan Ford, I am not a fan of his version of the book. I like the second version of the book. But that's what the runway looked like in Chongqing. McDonnell also made it in the comic strips. His roommate, Frank Higgs, was a drinking buddy at Ohio State with Milton Caniff. And Caniff was the cartoonist for Terry and the Pirates. And it was the adventures of the Chinese Air Force and China National Aviation Corporation. And Caniff is working on his cartoon strip, was seen by 31 million people a month in the United States. And all these FBI cars pull up and guns are drawn. They come running in and said, you're under arrest. You're putting classified information in the comic strips. And Caniff has a really hard time convincing him. Said, no, I'm getting this information from my old drinking buddy from Ohio State, Frank Higgs, who played Dude Hennig in the comic strip. And Higgs talked Caniff into putting Daddy in the comic strip, and Daddy played himself. He was Captain Mac. He just added a K to the end of Mac. You can still buy these comic strips today. They're on from Amazon. They're in coffee table book form, and they're still sort of fun to read. And this was one of his more interesting flights. This is a flight from from Hong Kong to Kunming, and he's got $10 million of gold bearer bonds on the plane. He's got a guard, and he's trying to fly around an area where there had been reported Japanese fighter planes. So what's the safest place to go is into a thunderstorm. So he flies into this thunderstorm. and the radio operator didn't roll in the antenna quite quickly enough, and the plane was very quickly struck by 3 bolts of lightning, and it burned up all the electronics in the plane, and the plane was definitely going down, and the co-pilot panicked and had to be pulled out of the co-pilot seat and replaced by the radio operator to help McDonald land the plane. And when they broke through the clouds at the bottom of the thunderstorm, lo and behold, the sun was coming up, and there are 1,000 Chinese coolies building a road. And it was a mud road, but it would do very nicely. So when the plane finally rolled out, it picked up a lot of mud on the wheels, and the weight on the mud on the wheels and engine caused the plane to go nose down. The co-pilot got out of the plane and just started running. He was never heard from again or seen again. McDonald it took 12 days to build an airstrip for the plane to take off, and 12 days to get the plane repaired. And during that 12 days, they went to the bank where they'd taken the gold bearer bonds and put them back on the plane. And he landed in Kunming and said, "The plane is here, the gold is here." All of the crew, with the exception of one co-pilot, last seen running southeast in Sichuan province, China. It was written up in Los Angeles Examiner and in Collier's magazine. On December 6th, in your archives, you will find a letter where he wrote his parents and told his parents that the Japanese will attack the Hawaiian Islands. He was off by 4 years, but he and 5.5 million Chinese knew the Japanese were going to attack the Hawaiian Islands. They just didn't know when. The only people that didn't know the Japanese were going to attack the Hawaiian Islands were the Americans in the Hawaiian Islands. On December 7th and 8th, 1941, being the same day due to the international date line, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and they attacked Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, they blew up the Pan American Clipper that was moored right next to the runway, and they blew up all the CNAC planes that were on the runway. They failed to blow up the hangars where there were 5 more CNAC planes. McDonald had the only CNAC plane that was not in Hong Kong. He was in Rangoon with a plane load of passengers who happened to have Bill Pauly on that plane, by the way. He had a decision to make. Did he go to Chongqing as the schedule called for, or did he go check on his good friend Colonel Chennault? And Taungoo is a British base that is also in Burma, and it wasn't that far from where he was. So he flew to Taungoo, landed in between 66 P-40s that had 66 highly irritated Americans sitting in their planes with the engines running, ready to repel an attack from the Japanese. He pulled over, didn't stop the engine, dropped the door open, jumped out of the plane, ran across the runway. Chennault's running the other way, and they have a 5-minute meeting in the middle of the field. And I could find no documentation whatsoever about what they talked about during that 5 minutes. I would really love to know the conversation and how it went. But McDonald got back on his plane, flew to Chongqing, talked to the station manager. The station manager said, "You probably have the only CNAC plane left in existence. We cannot get Hong Kong on the radio, and you are under no circumstances are you to fly to Hong Kong." And McDonald thanked him for his advice. He went over, refueled his plane, canvassed his crew, took off for Hong Kong, and landed at 1 o'clock in the morning in a blacked out city. And just as the plane was coming in for landing, they flickered the landing lights so he could actually see where he was landing. And he found all the CNAC personnel were fine, and they were getting ready to get the other 5 planes ready to try an evacuation of Hong Kong. They refueled his plane and loaded it with the personnel from the Chinese Currency Board were put on board along with some other Chinese officials. He was due to take off at 2 o'clock in the morning. At 1:30, a warning came in from the Japanese that any pilot who takes off from this airport will have his head cut off if he is captured. McDonald took off for 2 o'clock and landed in Chongqing and got about 3 hours sleep and flew back to Hong Kong to help in the evacuation of 275 people from Hong Kong. Now, the last flight that came out of Hong Kong the captain was Chuck Sharp, who was the chief pilot. Captain McDonald flew co-pilot, and it was a DC-2, and it was rated to carry 22 people, and it had 74 people on board. And when they were going down the runway, they could hear Japanese gunfire in the background. And when the plane went off the end of the runway, it didn't go up, it went down. And shortly before it was going to hit the water, the ground effect kicked into play and the plane began to fly. and it slowly clawed its way back up into the air, and they made it back to Chongqing, and they released 74 very cramped but very happy passengers in Chongqing. They loaded the plane with all of the CNAC personnel were there, including Bill Bond, who was the vice president with Pan American, and they had plenty of time on the ride to Calcutta to plot what's the future for AVG for CNAC was going to be. They had flown survey routes from Calcutta over the northern route over the Himalayas, which was over a 22,000-foot mountain. I think the mountain was actually slightly shorter, but they claimed it was 22,000 feet. And they were going to fly to Kunming, and they were going to fly from Denjon over the southern route into Kunming. And in Kunming, they were going to put tungsten from the local tungsten mines on the planes and fly them back over the hump and swap them for more gasoline and gunpowder. And they explained that to the British. And the British thought they were a little nuts, but said, that's a hell of a good idea. We'll help support getting your operations set up here in Calcutta. And 2 days after that, they gave McDonnell 3 airplanes and Captain Higgs and Captain Engel, and they flew on a rescue mission, and they went to Toungoo, and they picked up Chenault and the ground crews for the 1st and 2nd squadrons. And the 3rd squadron wanted to stay behind and help the British try to fend off an attack from a rather vicious attack from the Japanese. So McDonnell and the 3 planes landed in Kunming shortly before daylight, and by noon all of the P-40s had flown in. And that was on the 19th. On the 20th, the Japanese flew 11 bombers over Kunming, not expecting any resistance. And out of the sun came, diving rather sharply at a very high rate of speed, as taught by Chenault, they shot down 4 of the 11 bombers, and 7 of the bombers were chased off, and only 1 of those bombers made it back to base. And the Flying Tigers had an offensive base of operations in China to attack the Japanese, and that was a really good thing for the Americans at that point. Now, this is an important moment in a turning point in the war. It is not even 30 days old. And over my head in the picture, that is the Japanese High Command. And they are looking down on the picture in the middle, which is the Salween River Bridge going over the Salween River Gorge. And it has on it Japanese Special Forces that are trying to sneak from Burma into China. And Tex Hill and the Flying Tigers come through and they blow up the bridge. And next day they come back, Tex Hill comes back, and they've got another bridge, and it's a pontoon bridge, and it's got Japanese Special Forces on it. And Tex Hill blows up that bridge. And when they come back the 3rd day, the Japanese are gone. Now, what was important about that moment in history is the Japanese had a very specific plan. Had they gotten across the river, they would have taken Kunming, they would have taken Chongqing, China would have been out of the war, and they intended to conscript somewhere between 2 and 5 million Chinese troops to help the Japanese fight the Allies in the Pacific. If the Allies, stretched as thin as they were in the Pacific, had to face an additional 6 million troops, the outcome in the Pacific could have been and probably would have been different. Now, McDonnell went back to his new day job, which was flying gasoline and gunpowder over the Himalayas. And General Albert C. Wiedemeyer, commander of U.S. forces in China, wrote, "Flying over the hump was the foremost and by far the most dangerous, difficult, and historic achievement of the entire war. CNAC lost 88 planes in 4 years, and the Air Transport Command lost 500 planes and 1,600 men in 3 years." And we believe that McDonnell took that picture because it was in his photographs and had no notations on the back at all. But they did keep China in the war. Now, McDonnell's most memorable flight that he took, and there are only 1 or 2 left, was he was sent, and Churchill wanted Chiang to go to India and meet with Nehru and Gandhi. And his job was to talk the Congress Party into remaining neutral and to not oppose the British during World War II. And Chiang met with Nehru and Gandhi, and they didn't like each other at all, but they agreed that that was what they were going to do. And Daddy was horrified when he got there, and the press was there in a rather large way. And the next morning, Chiang's picture was on the page of almost every Indian paper, and McDonald realized that every Japanese spy in India knew where Chiang was, and he was afraid they were going to get ambushed on the way back. So he talked the British into giving him 2 Spitfires as an escort to the Indian border, and he talked Chiang into the fact that we're leaving at midnight because the Japanese, they don't like to fly in the dark. So they flew to the border, and then he flew to Kunming and turned over his charges to General Chennault, who took good care of the Chiangs from there on. Now, this is a picture of McDonald with his girlfriend. And this is Peggy Spain from Birmingham. She was from the right side of the tracks. Daddy was from the wrong side of the tracks. His father worked in a steel mill. And they got married on August 1st, 1944. Chennault wrote a letter, which is in the book. It said, I'm sorry I couldn't be at the wedding because I was not only going to give the bride away, I was going to give the groom away too. Now, they went on their honeymoon in Kashmir, and they also went on an elephant hunt on the back of, on a tiger hunt on the back of elephants with the Maharaja of Cooch Behar, who was a great friend of CNAC. And McDonald's smiling because he shot his first tiger, which is pictured in this picture. And my mother is in serious need of a drink. There's no question about that. And my sister Cameron was born in Shanghai on January the 8th, 1947. And her godfather was General Chennault, and her godmother was Madame Chiang Kai-shek. And she did not know that until I got those papers, which you have. And I had to tell her who her godparents were. And she said, well, that's really interesting. Who were your godparents? And I said, I have absolutely no idea. Now, on August the 1st, 1947, Mao Zedong is coming right around the corner, and my father figured this is not a great place to raise a brand new baby girl. So he reluctantly left China on August 1st, 1947, and when his foot hit the United States, he was a captain with Pan American as soon as his foot hit U.S. soil. In 1958, Chennault had cancer and he was dying, and he called Peggy and Billy McDonald, called them both up, and said, I want you to come to my home in Louisiana, in waterproof Louisiana, and help me plan my funeral at Arlington Cemetery, which they did. And the funeral had 1,000 people in attendance at Arlington, and it was really quite a funeral. I think part of Daddy's job was to call certain generals and tell them, please don't come, because they didn't get along with Chennault very well. Now, in 1977, as I mentioned, he started his book, and he had a stroke. It didn't get written. I found the papers, and the book did get written. He died in 1985 in the 106 Observation Squadron in Birmingham as a salute to the last of the 3 men on the flying trapeze. Excuse me. I still get emotional about it because I was there. Flew over the gravesite in the missing man formation, and that's how the book ends. So, anybody got a question? I would add one more thing, is I spent 4 years working on his Distinguished Flying Cross and his Air Medal, and they were awarded to him on January the 17th of this year, and there will be a ceremony at Maxwell Field in 2 weeks, and I was very, very happy to get him those medals, which I felt like he certainly did deserve. So.
Can you describe his Pan Am experience after?
Yes, I can. I was trying to, if you do a presentation of the Rotary Club, it has to be 29 minutes. Because at 30 minutes, they just all get up and leave. So I was trying to get this down to in a 30-minute time frame. But he came back and was sent to Miami where they had me, and he was a captain with Pan American and flew routes into South America. He was promoted to Rio in Brazil, which back then was a beautiful South American city. His route was to Buenos Aires and to Bremen at the end of the Amazon River. I may be mispronouncing that, but there's a city at the end of the Amazon River. And you could buy beef and lamb in Argentina for 10 cents on a dollar. It was really rather amazing. And life in Brazil, first language I ever spoke was Portuguese. And we had a German nurse who translated whatever I said to my father because he didn't speak Portuguese very well. But right in the middle of that, my mother caught polio, and I got polio, and my sister got polio, and ours manifested itself as a cold. My mother's was a bit more severe, so we sent her to New York for treatment, and they called him from New York and said, Captain McDonald, we think it's time for you to retire and go home and take care of your family, which is what he did. So, but he was just a pilot, and he was not the greatest businessman in the world. He was just a pilot. And I would end on this one story. There was a lady who was a translator and taught English to the Chinese, and she wrote in her diary, she said, McDonald is a good egg, and that he has a funny sense of what is dangerous. And she came back and wrote in the diary 1 year later, in the lines in between, in pencil, and nothing over the last year has changed my opinion. So that's a fairly good description of what kind of pilot he was. He wasn't dangerous, and he didn't fly dangerously. He just pushed the airplane as hard as he could push the airplane. So, yes, sir.
In April of '42, some significant events took place. Chenault called for a great airlift effort to support his operation. And I was wondering, in your papers, did you see anything in there about the role that Chenault played and or CNAC played with Jimmy Doolittle in April of '42?
I do.
And or Caleb Haynes?
I did. Doolittle was flown out by Moon Chen, who was an American citizen, although he was also Chinese. And Moon, he didn't know who the hell Doolittle was. He was just some lieutenant colonel, because I think that was the rank that he had on at the time. And they landed in Michina, and they were getting overrun by the Japanese, and he wanted to get as many Chinese people on the plane as he could, and Doolittle got nervous and finally said something to Moon. He said, boy, you got a lot of people on this airplane. And Moon Chen got kind of mouthy with Doolittle and said, if you don't like it, you can get off. And so they did take off, and they were headed right for the trees, and they hit the top of the trees going out and made it. I mean, they bounced off the top of the trees and made it to Calcutta. And when Moon Chen opened the paper the next day, there's his passenger all over the front page of the paper, Doolittle raids. But Doolittle became a great friend to CNAC and came to our house to cocktail parties periodically, and was a very, very good friend to Daddy. And you had one other question.
Caleb Haynes.
I don't.
He was Army Air Corps Air Transport Command 10th.
The only Air Transport Command story that I would tell you that is interesting is Roosevelt sent Rickenbacker with an entourage to that theater to find out what's the problem with the ATC. Why is the ATC losing so many airplanes? So Rickenbacker knew McDonald from Men on the Flying Trapeze days. So they had a meeting, and Daddy called over all his pilots over here, and he said, okay, he said, now how many hours have you got? And he said, well, I got 10,000 hours. Well, how many hours have you got? He said, well, I got 15,000 hours, or I got 12,000 hours. And he looked over at Rickenbacker and says, you got any more questions? He said, no, that's one of them. He said, well, come on down here to the maintenance section. So he went down to the maintenance section for CNAC, and they had a full bar. I mean, this bar is really stocked. And it was for the senior mechanic for CNAC. And the Chinese mechanics were so good that this guy had trained, and they were so loyal that they would take a bullet for this guy. So the CNAC planes were simply better maintained, and they could carry more weight than an ATC plane could carry. And he gave Rickenbacker an interesting piece of information. He says, you're doing this backwards. You're flying the ATC as though it is a military operation. You have to fly over the hump as though it is a civilian operation. And I'm talking about procedures. I'm not talking about making these people civilians. So Rickenbacker goes back to the United States and sees Roosevelt. So we need to fire this SOB, and we need to hire General Turner. And General Turner turned it around and changed the appropriate procedures. And boy, the ATC just blew by CNAC like they were standing still. And they stopped losing as many planes and as many pilots. And they used those same techniques for the Berlin airlift, and it's in Turner's book. But I found those are in his papers that are now in this museum. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
I arrived a bit late, so I don't know if it came up, but are you aware that when you were mentioning Mac's attack in Shanghai against Izumo, that today is the 80th anniversary of that day, which is celebrated in Taiwan, and I probably now in the People's Republic as well, as Chinese Air Force Day, because it was also the day that Chennault's claim, contrary to General Julio Duhet, about interceptors against bombers, the Chinese put it into practice by intercepting the Japanese bombers, shooting down 2 and shooting up 2 more. And the Japanese realized at that point that if they were going to continue bombing in China, they would have to come up with fighter escort for them, which ultimately led to the zero. All of this happened today, 80 years ago.
Well, the last story, and then I'll answer your question, is Lieutenant Hansel, who Daddy replaced on the Men on the Flying Trapeze. He wanted to be a 2-star general, and he became a 2-star general. But he was flying bombers over Europe, and he flew 6 bombers over a French city. And 5 of them were shot down by the Germans because they didn't have fighter cover. And his plane was shot up, and some of his crew was killed. And Hansel went in and told his commanding officer, he says, well, I'm done. I'm not flying any more of my boys over there unless we've got fighter covers. And I was trained in Alabama. And those Tuskegee boys with those red tails on the planes, they'll do just fine. But I'm not going back unless I've got fighter cover. And when he went back, he had fighter cover. And he said, that crazy SOB in China was right. You do need pursuit planes. But Chennault was an interesting guy. That's all I can say. Yes.
Is that incident, you have a picture of the DC-2.5, is that covered in the book?
It is not, because Daddy wasn't part of that story. And what happened is Higgs was part of that story. And they would, if they knew the Japanese were coming, they would go hide. They'd land at these auxiliary airstrips that Chennault had built. And they landed, and a Japanese bomber came by and blew the wing off this plane. And the guy that drank a lot for CNAC, who was a great mechanic, he said, you know, I'm looking at these attachments, and I really think you can attach a DC-3 wing on a DC-2. It's going to be a little short, but I think it'll work. So he just went ahead and did it. He didn't ask any permission, and they telexed or whatever it is to New York, and New York sent word back and said, we just think that's a horrible idea. And they said, well, we've got the wing on there, and the plane is already loaded with passengers, and they are really going to be disappointed if we have to disembark them. So they just took off. And he said, you just have to fly it like that. And it worked out real well. And Harold Sweet was the pilot who flew that plane. But they eventually they did restore the aircraft. I suppose that was probably done after the war. I don't know whether it ever flew over the hump or not. Yes, sir.
You've got in your photographic collection more pictures of the DC-2.5 with the wing blown off than I've seen anywhere else. There's about 4 of them.
Those were taken by Higgs. Higgs took those pictures. There was a lady who had a Brownie. You know how the Brownies had the little leather strap? And she is, when they landed the plane and she walked away from it, the Japanese dropped the bomb, and the shrapnel from the bomb severed the strap on her Brownie, and she dropped her Brownie. But she was fine, but it did cut the Brownie right off of her hand. But the idea of flying that plane, the CNAC pilots and even the ones that are alive today, and there are only 3 or 4 that are left, they were a pretty live group, because every time you flew over the hump, you didn't know whether you were coming back or not. It was a crapshoot just to fly over the thing. But Daddy was chief pilot mid-1943, and I will end on this story. I'm at a war reunion in Ojai, and my father says, now we're going to go play golf with this guy and his son, and he's chairman of the board of this insurance company, and he's deacon of the Baptist Church and president of the Rotary Club and all this, and he's going to be really, really glad to see me. And I just want you to understand that when he gets really, really glad to see me, that it's okay. So his son's about my age, and so when we met him, sure enough, this guy was really glad to see Daddy. And I said, well, when we come back, I said, what's that all about? And he said, well, there was a knock on the door one night in Calcutta, and he said, what's the matter? And he opened the door and he said, Mac, you got to get me out of here. You're the only person who has the authority to take a plane and fly me to China. If you don't get me out of India, I'm a dead man. He said, what happened? He said, well, this cab driver was trying to hold me up, so I took a .45 down there and I put it right between his eyes and I shot him right between the eyes. So Daddy's taking this guy to the airport because his job's to take care of his crews. And he flies him to China and, gives him this watch and gives him all this money and all this stuff. And he hadn't seen him in 30 years. And I said, but he killed the guy. And he said, well, he didn't mean to kill him. He was drunk. So they were... There were a lot of those stories are in the book, and whenever I needed to cut which I'm going to do right now, cut my presentation short, I just cut a crash out, or I cut a forced landing out. That was easy. There were lots of those. But I hope you all have enjoyed that. It's been a pleasure being here. Thank you.